Welcome back, petrol heads, to the heat of the desert in Saudi Arabia. Another episode of F1 Brake Check is here. We are back again to talk about the latest news and happenings in the world of Formula One, including our breakdown of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. We'll discuss the short history of the street brawl in Jeddah. We'll have part two of our Tech Corner discussing the setup of an F1 car for a Grand Prix weekend. And Corey will attempt to melt my brain in our Stump the Pundit segment. So settle in, buckle up, and get ready to take maximum G-load on the latest edition of F1 Brake Check.
Welcome. You are listening to F1 Brake Check, the epic podcast for all things Formula One, where we discuss technology, history, news, and perspective. With your hosts, Scott Vick and Corey Broom.
And we're back with F1 Brake Check. With me, as always, is my intrepid co-host, Corey Broom. Corey, how are you doing this week, my friend?
Really good. We were talking right before the podcast. Over the weekend, went out to a whiskey tasting. It was just fantastic. Had so many different Irish whiskeys there. And as I was telling Scott earlier, they had a French whiskey that I had no idea that the French even made whiskey, but they do.
Who
and
knew?
It was absolutely fantastic. They aged the whiskey in cognac barrels. I love Irish whiskeys. One of my favorites. But Japanese whiskeys, oh,
Really?
yeah, seriously. They are truly a sipping whiskey. They're dangerous. They're that good.
Wow.
Yeah. Got to be
That is so
really
cool.
careful.
I was
How
going to
about
say,
you?
it's been a pretty uneventful week here. For those in the U.S., this was spring break for the entire family. So been kind of just taking it easy this week, not doing a whole lot. As we're recording this on Thursday, March the 14th, just sent my daughter back to college for her to start getting ready and for performances and stuff next week. Going to be real interesting. So, all right then. So let's talk about the history of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. A stark contrast from the wide open and flowing circuit of Bahrain, the Saudi Arabian Corniche circuit can only be described as a full-on street fight. The super tight circuit is blinding fast, with average lap times topping 160 miles per hour or 250 kilometers per hour. The circuit also features, by a wide margin, the most turns of any F1 track, coming in at 27, and is the third longest on the calendar behind only Spa and Las Vegas. Like Bahrain, the Grand Prix of Jeddah has had its share of controversies, with wide criticism by Amnesty International and other groups for Saudi Arabia's human rights record. The group claims that the sporting events held by the country are for the sole purpose of distracting the world from the purported abuses from the Saudi Arabian totalitarian government. Their role in the Yemen civil war and the assassination of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, which I know I mispronounced that, so I apologize. The fifth night race to grace the calendar never fails to entertain, and every running of the event has had the distinction of either a red flag or a safety car, and the 2024 edition continued this trend. Unlike the other night races, two of the three practices are held in the daylight with the significantly higher temperatures that the sunlight provides. In only the fourth running of the race, we got yet another storming race. Corey, your thoughts on the track and the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix in general?
I like the track. I have to be honest. I like how technical it is. I like the speed of it. I just love the corners. The only thing that I don't like about it is, you brought it up, the practices during the daytime where it's just too hot. It's just not a realistic practice.
Yes.
If you're racing at night, you should also practice at night, because that's more equal. The track is going to be too hot. The drivers themselves are going to be suffering from heat exhaustion as well. And it's just, I don't see a rationale for daytime practices. What about you?
Totally agree, because like you were just alluding to, is that because it is considerably hotter, it invalidates most of the data that is gathered on the cars during that heat, because everything is going to change. Your tire pressures are going to change with the differences in temperatures. Those requirements for the daytime running versus the nighttime running are totally different. And so really a lot of that information and data that is gathered during the practices that are held in the daylight, most of that data is really not of much use. So the teams really don't get any useful data out of any of the daytime running. A sprint type weekend where you really only have one useful practice before you're setting the car up,
I'm sure there's a rationale behind it. I just don't understand it.
To take what we were saying about how running in the daytime kind of invalidates a lot of the data that the teams gather during those practice sessions, let's go ahead and move into our tech corner, where we're going to dive into part 2 of our discussion on the time and effort required to set up a modern Formula One race car. Last week, we talked about the most significant time sinks in setting up a car: aerodynamics and suspension. This week, we're going to dive into the drivetrain, brakes, and electronics. So modern Formula One cars have long used electronics to measure the car's performance and used the data acquired to continuously improve the car. The electronics have also allowed the car's motor, transmission, and differential to be tuned to make the power delivery as usable as possible and to deliver maximum horsepower. Each circuit requires the drivetrain to be tuned to allow for the greatest delivery of power based on a driver's preferences. Before the advent of fuel injection and electronic ignition, mechanics would spend considerable time tuning the timing of the spark plugs and fiddling with air-fuel mixtures on the carburetors. Electronic ignition and fuel injection allowed for much faster tuning of the engine, quote-unquote, mapping, by allowing engineers to update the ECUs or electronic control units. Instead of having to fiddle with mechanical bits and pieces, they were able to make a few changes to the electronic control unit programming that they would upload to the ECUs, and then that would take and change the timing and the fuel injection settings. Later, computerization allowed the changes to be done with a few clicks of a laptop keyboard. Up until a couple of years ago, drivers would have a set of controls on their steering wheels and would oftentimes adjust the mapping multiple times during a lap based upon the needs of the car on that particular part of the circuit. The FIA eventually outlawed the practice and required the teams to select an engine mapping before qualifying, and changes to the map for the remainder of the weekend are not allowed. The need for engine mapping is to maximize the power delivery from the power unit. Fuel air mixture, power curves, RPM red lines, etc. can all be adjusted in a matter of seconds by the engineers with a couple clicks of a mouse. The engine mapping is monitored and modified by an engineer of the respective owner of the power unit. So Honda, Mercedes, Ferrari will all have engineers that are actually dedicated to the teams. The gearbox, on the other hand, still requires hours to change the gear ratios. Generally, the engineers working with the engine suppliers will select the gear ratio at the beginning of the season, and the mechanics will fit the gears to the housing. Because the gears can only be changed 4 times per season before a driver incurs a penalty, engineers will try to select the ratio that provides the best compromise for the various tracks, with the biggest changes often coming at tracks that require large differences in those requirements, like Monza or Spa, that have really long straightaways. They will, at that point, maximize the gear ratios to provide the absolute highest top speed that they can possibly get out of the power unit. The differential is the final piece of the drive line. Unlike the power unit and transmission, the differential is more open to changes during the car setup. Additionally, the drivers can still modify the differential during a lap from a control on the steering wheel. Like the rest of the car, the differential will be configured to a baseline at the factory and will then be fine-tuned during a race weekend. The teams will develop mappings for the race, and the multifunction display on the driver's steering wheel will advise them when they need to make a change during the lap. The electronics on an F1 car have a number of different jobs, and each component takes a different amount of time to tune. Other electronic control components, such as the steering wheel, brake-by-wire systems, and telemetry for data gathering, are still built by the teams, or they're built by a supplier to the team specifications. And the components can be tuned by the teams with a few keystrokes on a laptop, just like the engine mapping can be done by the engine manufacturers. All the power in the world from the driveline is not much good unless you can properly stop the car. Once again, the initial brake configuration is set up at the factory based upon past performance for a specific track and then fine-tuned at the circuit. The various parts of the brake system that can be modified are things like the compound of the brake pads, the size of the ducts that will provide cooling, and the front-rear bias of the braking force. Because the carbon ceramic brakes operate best at a specific temperature range, adjusting the cooling ducts is critical. If the brakes overheat because not enough cooling, the brake will fade and fail to slow the car down properly. Conversely, if the ducting cools down the brakes too much between applications, the brakes will not grab in the same way as they will when they're warm, and thus it'll increase the braking distance or it will lead to lockup. The adjustments to the brake ducts require changes to the opening size of the brake ducts and also the channels inside the brake duct housing that directs the airflow to the brakes. The ducts can be changed in a couple of minutes, as most of the teams use inserts that fit into the ducts that can take in and can increase or decrease the opening of the brake duct to allow more or less air into the ducts. The final piece is the bias for braking, which can be adjusted by the driver and will often be needed over the course of a race. The drivers can adjust how much braking force is applied to the front wheels versus the back wheels, and as the fuel burns off during the race, will require adjustments to the bias to reduce the chances of the wheels locking up, as ABS is not allowed in Formula One. In closing, as we have seen in this discussion and the previous edition, the time spent to transform an F1 car from race to race is considerable, and the maniacal preparations taken by the teams are done with an eye always on extracting maximum performance each and every Grand Prix weekend. So, Corey, your thoughts?
I'm always amazed to hear how fast the engineers and the drivers are to responding to those changes. It's amazing to me, the engineering feats that go into this.
All right, so let's move on to Stump the Pundit. Corey's going to try to melt my brain with a trivia question. So, Corey, what do you have for me this week?
This will be our last of the drivers, because the remaining drivers that I have not included, I think, are so obvious that a Drive to Survive fan would even understand these. Let's start out with number one. He has 83 races under his belt. He has 2 podiums. He's driven for 3 different teams, but has had 4 different teammates. He has a mixture, basically starting out in karting. He's gone to F2, and he's also driven in Formula E.
I'm going to have to go with K-Mag.
No.
Okay. No, I'm stumped. Go ahead. Tell me.
Alexander Albon.
Really?
Yes.
Because Williams, Red Bull, AlphaTauri. Okay, so those would be his 3. Yep.
Latifi,
okay.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Okay. So on to number 2. He's driven for 3 different teams. His best finish is 2nd place. He has 1 podium, 2 fastest laps, and a cumulative 188 points.
My first gut is to say Yuki, but that's not it, because I don't think Yuki's ever had even 1 podium yet. So I don't think it's Yuki. I'm going to go with Lando.
No.
K-Mag.
Oh, yeah, K-Mag.
All right. All right, so let's move on to the news and let's start breaking down the action from this last weekend. So first and foremost, my question to you, Corey, is do you think can anyone stop the Red Bull freight train?
Yes.
Do tell.
Red Bull. Red Bull will defeat Red Bull themselves.
You think so? But okay, so maybe I should have rephrased that. Do you think there's any other team
that
can stop the Red Bull?
No other team that
train?
Can stop them, no.
You don't think so? Red Bull could conceivably shoot themselves in the foot if all of these controversies with all of these different investigations of various high-level people inside of the team. First, we had all of the hullabaloo around Christian Horner and his allegations of inappropriate conduct. We heard at the beginning of this weekend, the same thing was happening with Helmut Marko, rumored suspension. And then right before the race, released a press release saying that everything had been put to bed and that he wasn't going anywhere. Who knows if some of this turmoil might be coming to a head at some point, because you have the leadership of Christian Horner, first of all, had the foresight to bring on Adrian Newey and has kept Adrian Newey engaged. And then Helmut, who has kept the ship righted throughout the entire course of Red Bull being a full constructor. You lose one of any of those 4, and the next few years for Red Bull could be very, very rough. Yeah. Especially if Newey goes to Maranello and is building cars for Ferrari. Oh my gosh.
How much of a genius is Vassar? I mean, he's soft-spoken, so you don't really hear a lot, but Oh my gosh, he's gotten so many aero engineers. He's got several other high profile engineers from Red Bull already.
Mhm.
Let's be honest, he's courting Newey. There's no doubt about it.
Oh, no,
He's
absolutely
going to
no
get
doubt
him.
about it.
Look at all the moves he's making. In
Yes.
a year, 2 years, Ferrari is going to be leading the pack again, all because
Yes.
of Fred Vasseur.
I do think you are correct, because I think that's part of the reason why we've seen such a strong turnaround at Ferrari. Week one, Leclerc finishes third, but he's almost 30 something seconds behind Verstappen. And this week they cut that gap almost in half. He was only 18 seconds behind Verstappen, which a lot of people are like, well, 18 seconds, that's still a lot. But when you're talking about like towards the end of last year, when Verstappen was winning races by 20, 30 seconds, to cut it to 18 seconds is tremendous. I think that every bit of the gains that Ferrari has made has been down to the leadership of Vasseur.
100% agree. And the thing that you're talking about too is people have to remember, our listeners hopefully would remember this. We're only in race 2.
Mm-hmm.
And he's cut the lead in half.
Yes.
By race 2. That's an amazing amount of time.
Speaking about other Ferrari news, so we also had this weekend, truly was just absolutely fascinating. Sainz practiced on Thursday, but he wasn't feeling very well.
Yeah.
And then Friday morning, he wakes up, something's not right. They took him to the hospital and found out that his appendix was about ready to burst. And so he had to have emergency surgery for his appendix. And so their reserve driver, a very young Oliver Berman, gets promoted in the span of a couple hours from being the F2 pole sitter to participating in his first practice as a Ferrari driver. Berman was the youngest driver to ever start for Ferrari at only 18 years old. He's the first British driver to start for Ferrari since Nigel Mansell 33 years ago.
Wow. I didn't
and
know
he
that.
missed out on getting into Q3 on his very first attempt by literally half a second. Half a second faster, and he would have been in Q3 and probably would have qualified somewhere 7th or 8th place, which for someone who 2 hours earlier wasn't even prepared to drive for Ferrari, to jump into the seat and to be able to be that impressive. And then not only that, keeps his nose clean, drives an absolutely flawless race, and ends up finishing in 7th and gets points on his very first outing.
Yeah.
Just amazing. So your thoughts, Corey?
Just like Leclerc said, there's no doubt we're going to see Berman on the grid at some point. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he's 18. It's amazing how great he did. And really just looking at his performance just in and of itself was just phenomenal. He fantastic driver. I'm really excited to see him, what he can do on the grid when he actually gets a car.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Absolutely.
Maybe he gets into Williams. If Albon leaves, goes up to Mercedes, leaves a spot open for Berman, that would be that would be fantastic for him.
Absolutely. I think that would be, I think that would be, absolutely mega. Or if Williams is actually able to hang on to Albon and, Sargent ends up, losing his seat, putting Berman in to that second Williams seat, and having Albon as a teammate. Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah.
I'm like,
will do.
I don't see that happening. I think that Albon's too good to even though, despite the gains that Williams has made towards the end of last season, and especially and even in this first part of this season, I don't think Albon's just too good to stay at Williams,
no
unfortunately.
He's got to go somewhere else. Yeah. Mercedes or something else. But, the other possibility would be Haas.
Yeah.
They would be in the same family. Right.
Yes, so absolutely, still be in the Ferrari family. So
I would hate to see either Hulk or K-Mag leave, but I mean, that would be a very good replacement.
Yes, absolutely. I think it would be, it would be mega. That's for sure.
No doubt about it.
All right, jump to Aston Martin, because that'll lead into the next subject after that. So the first thing we have to talk about at the top of the show during our history lesson about the Jeddah circuit is that we've had a 100% hit rate on either a full safety car or a full red flag. And this year was no different in the fact that Stroll, he brushed the wall on lap 7, went into the wall, and he brings out a safety car.
That brush actually broke the axle.
Yeah, it actually broke.
That's why he landed into the barrier, because he couldn't steer. He was basically along for the ride.
Yeah, brushing the wall was hard enough that it actually broke the suspension. And you can actually see the wheels all cockeyed as he's going across the track into the other barrier. For the first time this season, we had someone other than Max Verstappen leading a Grand Prix, because McLaren left Lando out because under the safety car, almost everyone else pitted, including Ferrari and Red Bull, going for the double stack to take on new tires behind the safety car. But McLaren and left Lando out, Mercedes left Hamilton out, and Haas left Hulkenberg out. When the race restarts, Lando is leading the race because he stayed out, with Max Verstappen right behind him. And so Lando was actually able to hold off Max for, I believe it was either 3 or 4 laps.
Yeah.
Lando, when given the chance to lead, as we saw last year at Silverstone as well, that with the right car, Lando definitely has what it takes to be a race winner. And I really think that this is going to be the season where we're going to see the one weekend, things are going to fall his way. And I really think that we're going to see Lando get his first win this season.
I'm really looking forward to it. He doesn't panic like Russell.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Sorry, Russell.
First of all, let's talk about Russell's teammates. So Hamilton, like we said, during the safety car period, Mercedes left Hamilton out on track. Piastri takes and comes out behind Lewis Hamilton. The duel that went on with Piastri and Hamilton was just made for some absolutely fascinating watch.
Piastri is fantastic. He's a great driver, no doubt. But you're going against Lewis Hamilton.
7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, you're not going to win that one. Think about this too. Yeah, he wasn't able to pass Hamilton, but he kept very close. How many people on the grid today could do the same thing Piastri did? Not many.
There's probably maybe 5 or 6.
Maybe
out of the 20 drivers that could have done that.
Not many. That
Verstappen
could keep pace to Hamilton.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I understood. He didn't pass him, but good Lord, he's only been in the sport 2 years now. Not even 2 years.
I mean, and he was constantly up.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it.
He was constantly up Hamilton's gearbox. Now, speaking of Mercedes, the other thing though too is that George had a decent race. He qualified 7th, finished 6th. It was really notable for the fact that this was the second race in a row that George has out-qualified Hamilton. And it makes you kind of wonder, is the team already starting to favor Russell as the team leader?
I don't doubt it, because just looking at it from a pure strategy standpoint, this guy isn't going to be here next year. This other guy is going to be here next year. You're going to want to get him as far up as possible. And yeah, we may all love Lewis still, but he's not going to be there next year. So I would understand if Mercedes was starting to favor Russell a little bit more. I mean, we see this every single time that a driver's about to leave, either on their own volition, like with Lewis, or not, like, say, Vettel. You saw that last year when Ferrari cut him, that they were barely talking to him, midway through the season. So teams starting to favor the person that's going to stay there, the driver that's going to stay there, versus the driver that's about to leave.
Yep, absolutely. Back at Aston Martin with Alonso's qualifying and race pace. So Alonso is still extracting maximum effort out of the car. At the same time, you have to wonder, when is Aston Martin going to take that next step? All right, so going back to the drivers that the teams left out under the first safety car, Hulkenberg actually finished 10th, got the first points for Haas for the season, but he owed a lot of that to the team and K-Mag doing an absolutely stunning job of holding up Tsunoda, Albon, Sargent, Danny Rick in trying to help Hulkenberg get a big enough gap in front of him that he would be able to take and pull into the pits, get his tire change, and get back out on track ahead of K-Mag in order to retain his place in the running order. And K-Mag did an absolutely brilliant job to take and hold off 4 really talented drivers.
Well, just to bring up that whole 20-second time penalty, I thought that was just completely outrageous that they did that to him.
It
20
was
seconds. I mean,
2 separate 10-second
yeah,
penalties.
exactly. 2 separate ones. Unbelievable that they did that. The infractions weren't that bad. If you really look at what he did, they weren't worthy of 10 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's move on to the rest of the field. So speaking of pit stops, first of all, what the hell is going on at Sauber? So last week, Valtteri Bottas had a 57-second penalty, and this week it was the tables were turned, and this time it was Zhou's turn to have a 40-something second penalty.
The thing I was thinking about after that in that race is I made no secret of my fandom for Valtteri Bottas. I think he's a phenomenal driver. But when he can't get your car up into points, there's something wrong there. So I'm hoping, reading between the lines, that I'm hoping next year when Audi takes over that Bottas is seeing, okay, well, this is what's happening. Maybe I stay for another couple of years. He's too talented of a driver to sit back in 16th, 17th, 18th places. There's just no way he should be doing that. Zhou, I think, is a fantastic driver too. To your point, those engineers better do something quick because that's 2 weekends in a row.
So jumping back to Williams real quick, though, when we were talking about how Albon got held up by K-Mag in K-Mag's brilliant drive, but Albon had another great weekend, just barely missed on getting into Q3, despite being stuck behind K-Mag. He actually used that to get ahead of Yuki. Albon was able to make the most of it and get around Tsunoda later on. Had a decent weekend. And then Sargent, I really want to like Sargent. I really want to be behind him. And he's starting to show flashes of brilliance where there are times where he is only literally hundredths of a second off of Albon's time. But then at other times, he just looks like still just completely lost. So what's your take on Sargent at this point in the season?
It's only race 2, but he's definitely showing markable improvement from last year. He hasn't crashed yet. So
very true. Very, very true.
Very good so far. He kept Danny Rick behind him. I kept watching the timings between them, and he had Danny behind him anywhere from a half second to over a second behind him. Danny couldn't pass him. So either that's really smart racing on Sargent's part, or it's horrible driving on Danny Rick's part. You take it.
No, I think it really was. This is one of those times, one of those flashes of brilliance that I was talking about.
Right.
During this race, he had every measure of a much more experienced driver in Danny Rick. Then he was able to keep him behind, and not only that, was actually able to get around Yuki as well.
Yes,
at the
forgot about that. You're right.
The race, and had both racing bulls behind him. Comes home 14th. That's a pretty strong accomplishment from Sargent. Speaking of the racing bulls, though, I want to get your take on this. First and foremost is Yuki had an absolutely brilliant qualifying. He qualified 9th, got stuck in traffic, ended up finishing 15th. But this was the second weekend of 2024 that he out-qualified Ricciardo and out-qualified him quite handily. Your thoughts? Do we really need to start giving Yuki way more credit than what we've been giving him? Or is it a matter of Danny Rick is still having a hard time finding his confidence as a Formula One driver?
I really like Danny Rick, but at a certain point, you have to look at what is this driver doing? Not does this driver have a good personality? So with that being said, ever since mid-year last year, Yuki turned it up. There's an overdrive in Yuki or whatever he has, but he found that extra bit that he needed to find. Because when Red Bull put Danny Rick back in to AlphaTauri, Yuki wasn't doing that well. In fact, you and I commented on a few podcasts that, hey, Yuki's out. Ever since they introduced Danny Rick and he had that one drive for toast right before he left, Yuki has looked phenomenal.
Yes.
if this holds up for, say, another 3 or 4 races, in my mind, he is the team lead.
Oh,
I
yeah,
know Danny was
absolutely.
put there, but Danny is not the team lead. He just isn't. And at this point, I wouldn't even say he's a good number 2. Now, I know that in the race, Danny had a horrible pit stop, which
Yes.
attributed for him to be put back so far. But again, if you did that to Max, okay, I know I'm taking extremes here, but just, for sake of argument, you put a driver like Max in, or Checo, or somebody else, Landon,
Mhm.
you put them in that same spot, they would have passed Sargent, they would have passed Albon, they would have passed Yuki, they would have passed all those drivers. But Danny wasn't able to. He still wasn't able to close the gap with Sargent. What your question was, as far as Yuki goes, I think he's the real deal. This time last year, or even mid-season last year, I would have said, no, he's proving himself time and time again against a
Absolutely.
driver that's supposed to be leading him. So in my mind, I think it's Yuki all the way.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I really think it's a combination of the car doesn't suit Danny Rick.
And
Because, I mean, as we saw,
McLaren didn't suit him. I don't buy that argument anymore.
But see, I do, though, only because when they did a test last year, when Danny Rick got back in the Red Bull for the first time, his time in that same car would have put him next to Max Verstappen at Silverstone.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's not able to get the best out of the car. I still think he's having some confidence issues, both from his last year at McLaren, getting dumped, and then breaking his hand in only his first or second race, or was it? I can't remember.
Third race, yeah.
Third race back, he breaks his hand. I just think that right now, Danny Rick is definitely suffering from a confidence problem, and that confidence problem is not allowing him to get the maximum performance out of the car, whereas Yuki right now is getting every bit of performance out of the car and
100%.
then some, and he's showing up his very, very highly rated teammate. And like you said, I'm starting to really think that Yuki's the real deal. If something happens with Checo, I think Yuki is definitely making a very strong case for him to be in that second Red Bull seat.
At least give him a shot. I mean, what's the worst that could happen?
All right. Well, real quick, let's wrap it up and talk about Alpine. The most notable thing for Alpine this weekend was Gasly had the misfortune to be the season's first retirement.
Yeah.
In the fact that his race was pretty much over with before the first lap was even completed. They basically told him, pull it over, shut the engine off. There's something wrong. And in order to save the engine, they had to basically kill his race before it really even got started. And Ocon's pace was just pitiful. Last year, Alpine had some issues. They had some misfortunes. They let Omar go, but they were already starting to right the ship on some of their misfortunes and everything, and they had a string of decent luck. Gasly had that brilliant drive at Dutch Grand Prix, but now the car has completely fallen off. They're nowhere even close to where they were last season and everything, that you have to kind of wonder, maybe letting Omar go was not the smartest thing to do.
Right.
Who knows? Your thoughts?
No, I agree. I like Omar anyway. I thought he was a great leader. I thought that he was really making strides at Alpine. But the problem that you have at Alpine is they were so far behind that to get that ship righted, it was going to take some time. The way that they did that, I think, was unprofessional, especially midway through the season.
Yeah, which is unheard of. That's absolutely unprecedented.
100%. To your point, I think that because of what they did and letting him go so soon, they're seeing the effects of that now. Yeah. This car isn't where it should be. If you left him in place, who knows?
On that note, I think it's about time we bring it home. What do you say?
Sounds good.
All right, so let's park the car in the paddock and say goodnight. F1 Brake Check is all talked out. Join us next week when we'll talk about the latest news, preview the Australian Grand Prix, and we'll have a new topic for our Tech Corner. And Corey will once again try to twist my noodle with a new question for Stump the Pundit. Until then, he's Corey, I'm Scott. We are the pundits of F1 Brake Check. Let's go!
Thank you for listening to F1 Brake Check. If you have enjoyed what you heard, don't miss a single episode by hitting that subscribe button in your favorite podcatcher, or you can watch the video version on YouTube. Help us grow by sharing us with your friends and fellow F1 fans. You can contact us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, TikTok and X at F1 Brake Check. Our website is f1brakecheck.com, where you will find links to all our content. We value your passion and your feedback, so please take a moment to review our podcast. Your reviews help us grow and improve, and it means the world to us. Share your thoughts, rate us, and let us know how we can make the show experience even better. F1 Brake Check is a production of Brake Check Media. For your hosts Scott Vick and Corey Broom, until next time, keep yourself inside track limits, and try not to pitch it in the kitty litter.